The Banshee of Hy Brasil by Ciarán Laverty. The currents had borne someone foreign to the shores of Connemara. Up the craggy green slopes he traipsed, his sights firmly set on the flickering firelight of a none-too-distant thatch-roof cottage. He flung the door open, his clothes still sopping wet and dripping all over the hardwood floor. The room was full of pike smoke and the odours of burning tobacco and spilled beer. 3 faces watched as the young man slumped in a drowsy heap to the ground, and one of the men ran to lift the wearisome layabout onto a stool. "Toss, fetch a blanket," came his command from between his pipe-clutching lips. He undressed the shivering boy and got a blanket tossed through to him. Soon enough, the boy was wrapped and placed before the fire, his clothes laid out on the hearth to dry. The landlord, who was the man who had seen to the boy's comfort, checked his forehead for temperature. "He's tried to off himself at wager," Toss said, with his hands on his hips. "Has he a fever, Mick?" came the third man's voice at last from the rim of his glass. "Buggered if I know, Finn," Mick shrugged. "He's cold enough to the touch." "I should think so," the boy cluttered. "I've just come out of the fecking sea." The 3 men were aghast. "He's a fiend," Toss exclaimed when he heard the boy's accent. "How does a corkman wash up in Connemara? Have ye sense about the lad?" Mick wired as he blew a cloud of smoke toward the ceiling. The young man pulled the blanket closer to his chest and leaned further toward the fire. His eyes met Mick's, and the landlord saw something there that he'd only ever seen in the eyes of children who'd got sight of a dog at a sheep's throat, or a bag of kittens in a bucket of water. "My name's Sean Prendergast," the boy managed. "How have you gotten here, Sean? You're a bloody long way from home." Sean shuddered, as though the question enthused some profound panic in his heart. He breathed a few deep breaths, then addressed the 3 men at once. "I was with the crew of lads down at Sleehead, hunting baskin sharks. You get crews from all along the coast out there all day when the bastards are in season. And we saw a monster of a yoke out further than the rest. I says to get after him, and sure we took off like the devil was coming out of Killarney after us. This thing was massive, and we harpooned him well enough, had him strung up and ready for the haul. And the next thing we know, there's not a shred of light anywhere. We'd sailed right into a fog, densest fog I ever saw. Couldn't hardly tell who was in front or behind me. And sure after that we gave up on the fish and made the turn about. Quick as the fog came, we were struck by a wave. I thought the shark had come up and rammed us, convinced myself my last sight be that toothless, bony maw of his. But he never came. And the waves kept crashing, and the wind was howling bloody murder. Not a drop of rain was falling, but by God, that was some storm. I remember being tossed about like a doll, screaming and shouting, but not a soul was shouting back. I thought for sure I was dead. My arms were numb from squirming, and my jaw could have fell off if I'm honest with you boys. But then I felt ground beneath my toes, and thank heaven I did, 'cause I dug in as best I could. Rocks, sharp as a dragon's arse, all jutting out into the sea. I would have been slammed up against them by the waves. I scarpered along the rock face and managed to get myself atop of them, thinking myself damn lucky. That didn't last long. The fog was still there, but it hung just off the shore, and the moment I stepped foot ashore, you couldn't have asked for a day more clement. Clouds up above and skies blue as you liked them. I started shouting for boys again, wandered along the beach as I did, and it was all pebbles as white as snowballs. Then I thought to myself that I must have died, that this was some real afterlife, and the gates of heaven were just a fairy tale. The fright drove me spare, and I went running off further inland, all along the rocks, and by Christ, those rocks were black as coal, but they were like huge chunks of glass. I fell like a sack of shite down a slope and cut my knees to ribbons on the way. That was when I saw them. It was a little forest, like a fairy wrath, and for those few trees it was the dead of night. Little folks were dancing around a ring of fires and playing wild music. I tell you, it was beautiful, a face fit for a king. I thought if this was to be my afterlife, then I can be content with it. Next thing I know, the little bleeders are screaming and scarpering. I hear this awful crunching sound, and then all of a sudden, this beast of a man, about 9 foot tall, lumbers out from the rocks, and is plucking the weons off the ground and eating them whole. Blood was running all down his chest, and his hair was red all over. I was froze with shock, when another one reared up out of nowhere. They were squabbling, the pair of them, like buzzards on a hare. I took off then up the rocks again, and kept climbing. I had to see where I was, try to see above the fog. My hands had gashed to nothing, the rocks were so sharp. I finally reached the peak, a perfect bloody pyramid of black glass. When I looked about, I could see the peaks of Slee in the distance. Only then it clicked for me. That was Hy Brasil, the island from old legends that appear once in every 7 years above the ocean. We all knew the stories, us sailor lads, but we thought it was all just shy to spook you. But it's real, and I'm glad I saw the peaks of Slee, 'cause if I hadn't, then I wouldn't have the sense to flee. I turned to start my way back down when I saw her. She was floating above the peak, naked as a newborn, but with things like rags trailing from her arms in the wind. Her back was turned to me at first, but then she spun like she was swinging from a noose, and her face was grey with sunken black eyes, and a mouth like a well. She squealed at me. Her lips not moving a touch, and I was gone, running back down the rocks faster than I ever ran before. I could hear her screeching the whole way, and those giant cannibals were howling too, and by the life of me I'd say the Morrigan was cawing, and the hounds of Q were baying for my blood, 'cause there was some unearthly chorus filled my ears as I dove back into the sea. I swam till my arms felt like they'd come out of the socket, and my legs were ready to seize up. There I was, like a bloody dumb seal, struck with panic and hardly able to move, and this screaming getting closer and closer again. Then something took me by the arm, and when I looked, I saw this brown fin slicing through the water, with a feckin' harpoon shaft sticking up a few feet further down. That bloody shark. I don't know how far he carried me, for I blacked out somewhere along the way. When I woke up, I was on the beach, and I could see this place from the sandbar. I had no bones about coming up here, 'cause it looked more like Ireland than that hell of black glass and snowy marble. I don't know what will become of me. I've heard the banshees cry. That's a mark of death. Tears began to brim in Sean's eyes, and the 3 men in the sheep-inn stood flabbergasted by his tale. The boy wiped his nose with hands flayed by rock, the flesh white and wrinkled. His knees were red raw, and his feet bore deep gashes that were yellowing at the sides. Toss took a long draw from his pipe. "Have yous ever heard such drunken nonsense in all your lives?" he scoffed. Before anyone could answer, the clock told the hour, and the fire in the grate began to dim. A chill crawled down the chimney, and frosted the beer in every pint glass, as darkness consumed the place. And the door was flung open by a sudden sea-spun gale. There in the doorway stood the Banshee, her flesh rotten with ancient inhumanity, and her mouth agape in a terrible scream. The three Galway men had little time to contemplate the veracity of Sean's tale, or the morality of his heart. They died with unanswered questions, and all in that sheep-inn were uncertain of their doom when it came. The only certainty lay in the bay from which Sean had emerged, for slithering drowsily along the ocean floor was a basking shark, whose hide was pierced by a harpoon, and whose blood ran in cloudy rivulets up toward the waves through the abysmal onyx of the coastal waters.